What the hell's going on with that? Anyway, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about radio. It's the thing that a lot of us, including me, grew up with and absolutely loved. It was a sonic window to a world of possibilities. And in particular, I want to talk about FM radio, because if you were a young music listener at any time between the 1960s and sometime in the early 21st century, FM was your go-to spot on the dial. But it wasn't always so. Now, prior to FM's invention, all mainstream radio existed in the AM format. And this format was lowish fidelity, but it was good for the time. When it became popular in the 1920s, it was shockingly good fidelity, and it was even better than most of the acetate discs that were circulating at the time as the most common way to listen to sound in the home, your 78 disc. And radio had everything, and sometimes it's easy to forget that. Prior to television, which took off in the 50s, and FM, which took off in the 60s, which we'll get to in a moment, everything was on the radio. So you had drama, you like Orson Welles, you had comedy like the original Amos and Andy, you had music of all sorts, you had news, weather, sports. Ronald Reagan was someone who was a baseball announcer on the radio. And so you can see that radio was everything that sort of the internet and streaming is today. Now, television came in the 1950s, and a lot of the most popular radio acts, so long as they weren't physically ugly, just rolled over onto television. All of the big names of the golden age of television, your Steve Allens, your Sid Caesars, later on your Johnny Carsons, your Milton Berles, all of these people, they were radio stars. And far from video killing them, live TV, and later on in the mid-50s, the popularization of the Ampex video tape recorders, the professional ones, the 2-inch ones, it made most of these people even bigger stars than they were. And like I said, things like The Lone Ranger, Amos and Andy, all of these popular shows from the early days TV, they were radio shows that just decided to become television shows. Now, radio keeps soldiering on. Television does eat into some of radio's grandeur, but there are places where you can listen to the radio that you cannot listen to the television, namely when operating an automobile. And so car radios ended up becoming increasingly common, especially when you had transistorization. And so radio kept soldiering on. Now, throughout all of this, in the 1930s, FM, frequency modulation radio, was invented. And the difference between it and AM, from the point of view of the listener, is that the fidelity was excellent. Just like Steely Dan said, no static at all when you've got a clear signal on FM radio. But no one was really interested in it. The corporate world had their AM transmitters and their other equipment that was designed only for amplitude modulation, which is what AM stands for. And so no one really adopted it. There were like 3 FM stations in America in the 1930s, and they were all sort of experimental. No one really cared. Now, after the war, people started to care. And FM initially took off in Europe, where most of the radio stations were state-owned. So the West German state-owned broadcaster began to play classical music on FM radio because of the fidelity being so much better. It took a lot longer in Britain and France, but eventually these countries as well, they more or less duplicated what they were already doing on AM on FM. So if the story in Europe was relatively early adoption of FM and using it just as a high fidelity version of what people already were used to, in America, the story was much more different, but culturally much more interesting. In the 1950s, America ignored FM. Totally ignored it. By the 60s, though, something interesting happened, because the FCC passed a rule that said you cannot duplicate your programs on FM and AM. So a radio station owner that had an AM station couldn't just use FM to play the same thing the way that they were doing in Europe. This left these FM signals sort of available for anyone who wanted to use them. And the lack of interest by the big corporate guns of the time allowed something very interesting to happen in the mid to late 1960s. Small business owners, many of them young, some of them were hippies, they purchased their own FM radio stations. They got their licenses and everything, and they started playing stuff that the young kids were interested in. They started playing experimental music. They started doing things that would become staples of FM in the sort of 1970s golden age of musical FM radio. There were people like Jim Ladd, for instance, on the Mighty Met, KMET in LA, who sort of is in many ways the prototype or the archetype of the great FM radio rock DJ who used the platform to create sonic soundscapes. Well, sonic soundscape is a bit of a tautology, but you know what I mean. Theater of the mind, as he said. And he would insert his opinions. He would have people reading poetry. He would have interesting long form interviews. He would play songs that were very long because with AM, the rule was basically right. The single's got to be between 2 and 3 minutes, where on these longer songs coming out of the worlds of psychedelic hard rock and progressive rock, these 20-minute songs that took up an entire side of an LP, people were playing that on FM radio. And so FM radio became the wild, wild west. And while the older people kept on listening to AM, the young people were listening to FM because that's where the young DJs, some of them only 18, 19, 20 themselves, they were playing the modern, interesting music and presenting it in a relatable, interesting, and at times theatrical way. Now, by the end of the 70s, FM radio in America had taken over from AM in terms of popularity. And this was also a time when music radio became much more prevalent than other forms of radio, like drama or comedy or even news. And these two events are related, but they're also related to something external to the radio world. More and more people started to listen to music on FM in the 70s because there were more and more FM stations. And as more and more FM radios were becoming options in cars, people were thinking, well, hang on, I want to listen to the high fidelity music, not the low fidelity music. And then something else happened to AM radio, which was a bit of a knife in AM's old heart, which is that for things like drama and comedy and news and sports, people were increasingly turning to television. In the 50s, these things coexisted, but by the 70s, when television is now in color and you have television broadcasts through most of the day and most of the night, people say, well, why should I listen to, unless I'm driving in my car, why should I listen to a man saying, and the Philadelphia Eagles have a first down at the 12-yard line, when I can watch it in color? And the same goes for the news. Why should I hear about, Jimmy Carter trying to rescue the hostages in Iran when I can watch the video of it? So that was this shift that happened to radio in the 70s. And so FM was king, and with its kingly status, a lot of the same corporate hands that had previously handled the AM dial were coming into FM. And so what you got was the slow corporatization of FM, where yes, some stations remain independent in terms of their programming choices. The DJ, to quote Tom Petty, was saying what he wants to say, playing what he wants to play. Other stations had playlists developed by managers who were centrally located in places like LA or New York, and that also changed one of the good things about FM, which was it was ultra localized. Unlike a lot of AM stations, which had your syndicated NBC and CBS comedy and drama programs, FM was still very much a local, independently owned thing through the 60s and much of the 70s. And so when people say, oh, well, why did this band go big in this market? Why does Cleveland love this music and Philadelphia loves the other? Well, because you had DJs in various cities who said, I really like this band. I'm going to play a lot of their music on my station. And that obviously caught the eye of the record companies, which said, well, hell, if it does well in Cleveland, maybe it will do well in Boston as well. Those sorts of things. And we kind of began gradually to lose this in the 80s as FM became more and more corporate. Now, what's going on with AM in the 80s? Well, at the beginning of the 80s, AM was at its nadir. It was at its lowest form. Music had all deserted to FM by now, and people weren't really interested in hearing as much drama, comedy, and sports on their radio because of television. And then when cable television and satellite comes in, which it does by the early 80s, then AM has even more competition from a visual medium. Now, in the mid 1980s, something happened again with our friends at the FCC. And what happened was they dropped something called the Fairness Doctrine, which affected news and commentary on the radio. So, with the Fairness Doctrine, if you interviewed a right winger, you had to also interview a left winger. If you were presenting a news item, you would have to sort of keep it relatively objective and say, I believe that we should, save the whales, but Tom Smith from the opposing party believes we shouldn't save them, we should just shave them. Not the most interesting stuff. The Fairness Doctrine was repealed, which allowed for editorialization without limits on AM radio, which I could make an argument for. That's in keeping with the letter and spirit of the First Amendment anyway, that maybe the FCC was violating. And not a lot of people knew what to do with this either. But one man who made the journey from FM back to AM did. His name was Rush Limbaugh. Now, Limbaugh was someone who was both in AM sports radio and FM rock radio through much of his youth. And he started, once this Fairness Doctrine was repealed, he started talking about politics on his radio shows. And it eventually sort of became clear that, right, this guy is onto something. And so he became the king of a revitalized AM radio. With music having deserted it, talk radio became the natural way to resurrect it, because just to hear one man speak, the fidelity isn't as important as it is when you're listening to music. And so Limbaugh ushered in an AM revival in the late 80s and into the 90s. And a lot of the people who later became TV or internet stars started out on the AM radio conservative revival, because for various reasons, maybe to do with sociology. People have had different theories. I'm not really satisfied with any of them. But of all of these new talk radios, the radio stars in the late 80s and 90s, the majority of them were Republicans and conservatives, not Democrats or liberals. There was nothing stopping both sides. In some markets, particularly those with a more leftist population, like the Bay Area or Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, they had some left-wing hosts. But generally, and certainly the ones that ended up getting syndicated, they were generally following this Rush Limbaugh conservative Republican model. And, people like Bill O'Reilly, household names later on television, Sean Hannity, who just interviewed President Trump an hour ago or whenever it was, these people all got their start during this AM radio revival. And so at the turn of the 21st century, radio in the US was very healthy. FM had lots of music, although it was becoming increasingly corporate. AM was once again thriving because of all of the talk radio shows. And I could say that we can stop our story there, but let's see what's happening to radio today. Now, in Europe, which adopted FM radio first, traditional terrestrial broadcast radio is almost obsolete. Between digital stations and streaming, most people in Europe do not listen to traditional AM or FM radio. In the US, this trend is happening too. While FM and AM radio still exist, while FM is still the mainstay of music and AM the mainstay of the older generation of conservative talk show hosts, a lot of things have changed about all of this. One, the cutting edge of political commentary now is not on AM radio the way it was in the 90s. It is on the internet. It's on social media. It's on X, mainly right wing, Reddit, mainly left wing, YouTube, a general mix these days in terms of political commentary, although maybe 5 years ago it leaned more left. Rumble, very much right wing. And of course, I'm just naming a few. There are multiple platforms. And so when it comes to news, views, and commentary, the internet is the place where AM radio is now the mainstay of an older generation. People like Bill O'Reilly are still on the radio. people like Sean Hannity are, but where they were sort of young or middle-aged men in the 90s, they're sort of the old guard right now. And it's sort of appropriate that they're on an old guard format. And even that you can listen to them online. A lot of their older audiences might listen to them still on their AM radio, but you can listen to them online if you would like to. Now, what's going on the FM dial? Well, FM is still where there's a lot of music, but with the advent of Spotify and comparatively cheap data, and all of these other online ways to listen to music, a lot of people have given up on FM and are using Spotify for their music, whether it's the music they choose themselves or the algorithms that make playlists for you, which is what a DJ did, and you had it without the commentary. And as a result, a lot of FM stations that used to be mainstays of rock, which was the dominant pop music format during this golden age of American FM radio, a lot of these stations now have switched to Spanish language song programming because a lot of both Hispanic owned and actually Mexican based radio stations have bought up these frequencies that the other American English song singing companies have just decided to give up on because the commercial revenue they can make isn't sufficient. Now, there has always been an interesting relationship between Mexico and American radio, because Mexico for a long time had laws where you could have much stronger transmitters than the ones regulated by the FCC in America. So what do? Well, you put your transmitter that is sort of intended for American audiences in Mexico right on the border, and you blast the signal out. These were called the border blaster stations. And Wolfman Jack, one of the most famous, he was AM, one of the most famous DJs ever. He was on one of these border blaster stations. Now, with the AM signal travels much further. So with the AM border blasters, you could really get your signal out there. The Mexican transmitters for the FM stations, you could as well, but just not as far. The FM signal doesn't travel as far as the AM. And so that's an interesting quirk of radio history that you can mention too. So will radio die? Well, some could argue that when the corporations began to take over FM radio, beginning in the late 70s, things got worse. And then there was the FCC Act of 1996 under the Clinton administration, which allowed for what many would call a monopoly that was previously banned. So where one company could only own a small number of radio stations before the mid-1990s, once that act was passed, you could own virtually unlimited amounts. And so you see the rise of monoliths like Clear Channel, and that was really the beginning of the end of independent radio. And it was a few years after, in the early 2000s, where Tom Petty wrote The Lost DJ, a song about Jim Ladd, although metaphorically it could apply to a lot of DJs who did their own thing and gave the big, middle-fingered salute to corporate radio. So you could say that the life got sucked out of radio because of that FCC Act in 1996. You could say that the internet is what's done it. And I think that there's sort of a combination. I think that a lot of the radio stars of the 70s and 80s and early 90s could have maybe become major internet stars if the FCC hadn't sucked the life out of radio and made a lot of people forget some of these people. Not Jim Ladd. He was always out there, but there were others in smaller markets who weren't as familiar to the general public. But yeah, of course, the internet has a lot to do with it. And it is funny that while AM and FM sort of had interesting crisscrossing paths in most of the 20th century, in the 21st century, it's really a case of mutual decline as FM radio is getting replaced by YouTube videos and Spotify, and AM talk radio is being replaced by social media and live streaming. So that's a history of the great FM dial, which for a long time was the only way to get exposed to a lot of different kinds of music in high fidelity and later stereo with some really interesting characters as DJs. It's an end of an era that isn't quite over yet, but its golden age is certainly gone. And that's my opinion on that. So, as always, let me know what you think in the comments. And of course, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.